The cold hit first. It was a physical blow, a deep, invasive cold unlike anything the men had known in the humid tropics of Guadalcanal or the sweltering air of the Bismarck archipelago. It was January 1943, and the back of the U.S. Army 2.5-ton truck, rumbling through the snow-dusted hills of western Wisconsin, was a steel box of misery. The 20 men of the Imperial Japanese Army huddled inside, their thin cotton uniforms useless against a wind that sliced through the canvas cover. They were the survivors, the captured, the dishonored, a statistical anomaly in a war where surrender was unthinkable. Their destination was a place they could not have imagined. Camp McCoy, a sprawling 45,000-acre military reservation carved from the American heartland. When the truck finally jolted to a halt and the thick canvas flap was thrown back, the pale, weak winter sun was blinding. The prisoners squinted, their bodies stiff and aching. The figures waiting for them were silhouettes against the snow, tall and broad-shouldered, armed with M1917 Enfield rifles tipped with long, cruel bayonets. As the prisoners' eyes adjusted, a wave of profound disbelief washed over them. The soldiers were black. This was not what their officers had told them. This was not what the propaganda films had shown. The Americans, they had been taught, were a soft, decadent people. Their black population was supposedly a subjugated, ignorant underclass, depicted in racist caricatures as childlike at best, bestial at worst. Yet here they were, disciplined soldiers of the United States Army, their expressions unreadable, their authority absolute. As the first Japanese prisoner of war was ordered out of the truck, his exhausted mind struggled to reconcile the indoctrination of an empire with the reality of this frozen Wisconsin field. He was now a captive, not of the white men he had been trained to fight, but of the very men his ideology had dismissed as subhuman. This encounter, repeated in camps across the United States, would become an unplanned and unstudied crucible. In the strange, isolated world of the American prisoner of war camp, the rigid racial hierarchies of two vastly different societies would collide, bend, and sometimes break, testing the ideologies of two empires and revealing the complex, contradictory humanity of men caught in forces far beyond their control. The war had brought them here, but the peace that followed would be shaped, in some small way, by what happened next. The system that brought these men together was a logistical marvel born of geographic necessity. By 1942, with Allied victories in North Africa and the Pacific beginning to yield tens of thousands of enemy captives, Great Britain, overwhelmed and within range of German bombers, could no longer house them. The United States, with its vast, secure interior, was the only viable alternative. A massive construction program was launched, and by the war's end, more than 155 main camps and 500 branch camps dotted the American landscape, from Texas to Minnesota. The numbers were staggering: over 371,000 Germans, 51,000 Italians, but only 5,424 Japanese. This immense disparity was a direct result of the Japanese military code, the Senjinkan Asterisk, issued by War Minister Hideki Tojo in 1941, which explicitly stated, "Do not be taken prisoner alive." The Japanese soldier was expected to die for the emperor, either in a final suicidal charge or by his own hand. Those who were captured were often wounded, unconscious, or cut off so completely that resistance was impossible. They arrived in America not just as prisoners, but as men who had failed in their most sacred duty, officially considered dead by their own government. On the other side of the wire stood the Guards, men occupying a profoundly ambiguous space in the American war effort. Of the 1.2 million black Americans who served in the U.S. Armed Forces during World War II, the vast majority were relegated to segregated non-combatant units, quartermaster companies, engineer battalions, and transport corps. The military, reflecting the rigid Jim Crow segregation of the nation it served, operated under a strict racial hierarchy. Black soldiers were commanded by white officers, slept in separate barracks, ate in separate mess halls, and were often denied the opportunity for frontline combat, a policy justified by racist beliefs about their capabilities. Instead, they were assigned the vital, unglamorous work of logistics and service. This included the duty of guarding enemy prisoners of war. It was a task of immense irony. Men who were denied full citizenship in their own country, who could not vote in Mississippi or sit at a lunch counter in Virginia, were now entrusted to enforce the rules of the Geneva Convention upon soldiers of the German, Italian, and Japanese armies. They were the arbiters of discipline for men who, in their own societies, had been indoctrinated with notions of their own racial superiority. The stage was set for a unique drama, played out on the isolated stage of the POW stockade. In the first weeks at Camp McCoy, a brittle, watchful tension settled over the compound. The Japanese prisoners, organized by rank as stipulated by the 1929 Geneva Convention, initially tried to maintain the fiction of Imperial Army discipline. They viewed their black guards with a mixture of suspicion, contempt, and sheer confusion. The guards, members of military police escort guard companies, were under strict orders from the White Camp Command. Their mandate was clear: maintain security, prevent escapes, and enforce the rules without fraternization. Communication was nearly impossible. The linguistic and cultural chasm was absolute, bridged only by a handful of Nisei, second-generation Japanese-American soldiers, who served as interpreters, themselves occupying a precarious position between the captives and the captors. The prisoners tested the boundaries. They would refuse orders, feign ignorance, or stare defiantly. The guards responded with practiced military professionalism, their movements economical, their commands sharp, their authority backed by the cold steel of their rifles. Every interaction was a negotiation of power, a silent challenge to the prisoners' worldview. The physical reality of the camp itself was a form of psychological warfare. The prisoners were issued American Army fatigues, stripped of their imperial identity. They were housed in wooden barracks, heated by coal stoves against a winter that saw temperatures plummet to 20 below zero. Their diet, also mandated by the Geneva Convention to be equivalent to that of their captors, was a revelation. They received quantities of meat, fresh vegetables, milk, and coffee that far exceeded the rations of a Japanese civilian, let alone a soldier in the field. This overwhelming material abundance, this casual display of American logistical might, subtly undermined the propaganda that had promised them a decadent, collapsing enemy. The Black Guards were the visible agents of this system. They were the ones who oversaw the distribution of food, the ones who inspected the barracks, the ones who marched the prisoners to their daily routines. For the Japanese, every meal, every warm blanket, was a testament to the power of the nation that employed these men their own ideology had deemed insignificant. The initial standoff began to slowly, imperceptibly thaw in the face of this relentless, organized reality. The first significant shift in the relationship between prisoner and guard came not from a command decision, but from the pragmatic demands of labor. The Geneva Convention permitted the use of enlisted POWs for non-military work, and America's wartime economy was hungry for manpower. By the spring of 1943, Japanese prisoners from Camp McCoy and other facilities, like Camp Clarinda, Iowa, were being contracted out to local farms and industries. They harvested sugar beets in Minnesota, cut pulpwood in Wisconsin's northern forests, and worked in canneries packing peas and corn. For this labor, they were paid 80 cents per day in canteen coupons, redeemable for items like cigarettes, soap, and magazines. It was on these work details, outside the rigid confines of the stockade, that the dynamic began to change. Day after day, a small detachment of Black Guards would escort a group of Japanese prisoners to a farm or a lumber camp. For 8 to 10 hours, they would work in close proximity, united by a shared task and separated from the main camp's strict military hierarchy. The guards watched the prisoners. They saw men who were, despite their indoctrination, disciplined and incredibly hardworking. The farmers and cannery owners who had initially been skeptical of using enemy labor were frequently impressed by their efficiency. The prisoners, in turn, watched the guards. They saw soldiers who were not the lazy or incompetent caricatures from their propaganda. They saw men who endured the same blistering summer heat and the same swarms of black flies with stoic professionalism. They saw them handle their weapons with an easy familiarity and enforce orders with an authority that was firm but rarely brutal. The shared experience of physical labor, the common rhythms of a workday, began to create a space for a different kind of interaction. The rigid categories of enemy and guard, of superior and inferior, began to blur at the edges. A guard might offer a prisoner a cigarette, A prisoner might use a newly learned English word to ask a question. These were small, fleeting moments, but they represented a profound departure from the ideological certainty that had defined the beginning of their encounter. The war was an abstract conflict of nations and ideologies. A shared 10-minute break in the shade of an oak tree was a concrete human reality. One prisoner, decades later, would try to explain the subtle transformation. He recalled the shock of seeing black soldiers in positions of authority, a direct contradiction to everything he had been taught. But daily exposure began to chip away at the doctrine. He spoke of the guards' conduct, noting that while they were strict, they were also fair. He remembered a guard quietly pointing out a patch of wild berries during a break from cutting timber, a small gesture of shared humanity that transcended their official roles. They were not the demons we were told, was the simple summation offered by another former prisoner attempting to reconcile his wartime education with his lived experience. These interactions were never about friendship. The rules against fraternization and the immense cultural divide made that impossible. Instead, they were about the slow, dawning recognition of a common humanity. In the quiet moments, the shared silence of watching a sunset over an Iowa cornfield, the brief exchange of a smile after a particularly arduous task, the rigid roles assigned to them by the war became, for a moment, less important than the simple fact of their shared existence in this strange, isolated corner of America. The white officers of the camp command saw only prisoners being guarded. They did not see the subtle, complex human negotiations taking place on the ground, man to man. As the war in the Pacific raged on, the population of Japanese POWs in the United States grew. The bloody battles for Saipan in mid-1944 and Okinawa in the spring of 1945 produced a new wave of captives. These men were often different from the earlier prisoners. They were survivors of some of the war's most brutal fighting, many of them conscripts who were deeply disillusioned with the military leadership that had led them to disaster. They arrived at camps like McCoy, Heian in Texas, and Fort Hunt in Virginia to find a mature, highly organized system waiting for them. The U.S. military had refined its methods for handling this unique prisoner population. Nisei translators, now numbering in the hundreds, and trained at the Military Intelligence Service Language School at Fort Snelling, Minnesota, were essential. They not only facilitated communication, but also served as a cultural bridge, explaining American customs to the prisoners and interpreting Japanese behavior for the camp administration. The Office of War Information began developing re-education programs, publishing a Japanese-language newsletter for the camps and showing films that depicted American life, democracy, and industrial power. The Black Guards were an integral part of this evolving system. They were the visible mechanism of an immense logistical enterprise. They oversaw the movement of hundreds of men to and from work assignments, managed the distribution of thousands of meals per day, and stood watch over compounds that were, in essence, small, self-contained towns. The sheer, overwhelming scale of the American operation was a constant, unspoken message to the prisoners. Reliable supply of food, the access to modern medical care, the clean clothes, the heated barracks, it all spoke of a nation with seemingly inexhaustible resources. This material reality stood in stark, brutal contrast to the experience of the Japanese soldier in the field, who was often left to starve, abandoned by a logistical chain that had completely broken down. The authority of the Black Guards was therefore implicitly reinforced by the undeniable power of the system they represented. They were not just men with guns, they were the frontline administrators of a victorious and immensely wealthy nation. This fact did an enormous amount of work in dismantling the prisoners' preconceived notions of a racial hierarchy. Power, they were learning, was not just a matter of race, it was a matter of organization, production, and supply. Yet the story within The Wire was never a simple narrative of dawning understanding. A significant complication arose from the prisoners themselves. The Japanese POW population was not a monolith. Deep, often violent, divisions quickly emerged within the compounds. On one side were the hardliners, fanatical militarists, often non-commissioned officers, who clung desperately to the Bushido Code. They viewed surrender as the ultimate disgrace and saw cooperation with their captors as treason. On the other side were the progressives, or cooperators, men who were more realistic about their situation, disillusioned with the war, or simply pragmatic enough to want to survive. The hardliners attempted to impose their will on the rest of the prisoners, recreating the brutal discipline of the Imperial Army within the American camp. They held secret tribunals, administered savage beatings to those they deemed disloyal, and even carried out assassinations. At Camp McCoy, at least 2 prisoners were murdered by their fellow captives for being too cooperative with the Americans. This internal conflict presented a new and dangerous challenge for the guards. Their job was no longer simply to keep the prisoners in, it was to keep them from killing each other. They had to become detectives and peacekeepers, breaking up fights, identifying ringleaders, and protecting informants. The Black Guards found themselves policing a shadow war, a desperate struggle for control being waged by factions of a defeated army. They had to navigate the complex internal politics of the prisoner population, relying on Nisei interpreters and trusted inmates to understand the shifting allegiances and threats. For the guards, it was a stark lesson in the tenacity of ideology. Even in defeat, thousands of miles from home, the most fanatical Japanese soldiers sought to enforce the emperor's will. The black soldiers, tasked with maintaining order, found themselves caught in the middle, the arbiters of a conflict whose origins lay in a culture and a worldview utterly alien to their own. Their role shifted from mere sentries to something more akin to prison guards in a maximum security facility, responsible for managing a volatile and dangerous population. The final definitive climax of this strange wartime relationship was not a battle of arms, but a battle of information. On August 15, 1945, the voice of Emperor Hirohito, crackling over shortwave radio, was heard across Japan for the first time in history. His announcement of surrender, delivered in formal, archaic court Japanese, signaled the end of the Second World War. When the news reached the POW camps in the United States, it was met with a firestorm of disbelief. The camp commanders ordered the information to be broadcast over the compound loudspeakers. Nisei interpreters scrambled to translate and explain the imperial rescript on the termination of the war. For the majority of prisoners, the moment was one of profound shock, followed by a quiet, dazed acceptance. The war was over, they would go home. But for the hardline faction, the news was simply unbelievable, the ultimate American propaganda trick. Tensions inside the wire, already high, reached a breaking point. The fanatics raged, promising to kill anyone who believed the emperor could have surrendered. At camps across the country, black guards were placed on high alert. Extra patrols were mounted and leaves were cancelled. The guards fixed bayonets to their rifles and stood watch on the towers, looking down at compounds seething with anger, confusion, and despair. This was the ideological endgame. The entire justification for the hardliners, existence, unconditional loyalty to a divine emperor who could never be defeated, had just collapsed. In the hours and days that followed, the guards had to manage the fallout. They broke up brawls, stood by as Nisei interpreters patiently showed prisoners newspaper articles with photographic evidence of the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and escorted the most violent hardliners to solitary confinement. The climax was not a single dramatic event, but a tense, rolling crisis, as the psychological foundation of thousands of men crumbled simultaneously. The black soldiers did not fire a shot. Their victory was in their presence, their calm, their disciplined enforcement of order, while the ideology that had fueled their enemy for years simply imploded. They were the witnesses to the death of a myth, and their job was to keep the shrapnel from hitting anyone. With the war officially over, the vast machinery of the American POW system shifted into reverse. The primary mission was now repatriation. Beginning in late 1945 and continuing through mid-1946, the Japanese prisoners were processed, moved to staging areas on the west coast, and boarded onto ships for the long journey back to a homeland they would not recognize. Of the 5,424 Japanese prisoners held in the continental U.S., nearly all were returned. The final interactions between the prisoners and their guards took place on troop trains and in transit camps. The power dynamic had subtly shifted. These were no longer enemy combatants, but defeated men waiting to go home. Many of the Japanese, now free from the coercion of the hardliners, made gestures of farewell. They gave their guards small carvings they had made, offered formal bows of respect, or used their limited English to say thank you. It was a quiet, anticlimactic end to their years of close, enforced proximity. For the Black Guards, the end of the war meant a return to a different reality. Their unique wartime duty, managing the soldiers of a racist empire, was over. They had performed their mission with a professionalism that had earned the grudging respect of their captives and the official commendations of their white superior officers. They had been an integral part of a successful, complex military operation. But when they took off their uniforms, they returned to an America that still judged them by the color of their skin. The authority they had wielded inside the wire evaporated at the camp gate. They were once again subjected to the daily humiliations of Jim Crow segregation. Their extraordinary experience, this strange collision of race and war in the American heartland, went largely unrecorded. It was a footnote in the grand narrative of the war, an inconvenient story that complicated the simple tale of a unified nation fighting for freedom. The lessons they had learned and the lessons they had taught their Japanese prisoners were largely lost to history, preserved only in the scattered memories of the men who had lived it. What happened inside the fences of Camp McCoy and other facilities like it was a powerful, unplanned demonstration of a simple truth. Ideology is a fragile construct, vulnerable to the relentless pressure of lived reality. The Japanese imperial propaganda, a cornerstone of its war effort, had built a worldview based on a rigid racial hierarchy with the Japanese at its apex. This edifice, however, could not withstand the daily, verifiable evidence of disciplined, authoritative black soldiers. The American system, for all its profound racial hypocrisy, created the very conditions for this ideological dismantling. It did so not through deliberate policy, but through the overwhelming weight of its logistics and the pragmatic necessities of war. It armed black men, placed them in positions of authority, and tasked them with managing a population indoctrinated to despise them. The result was a quiet, powerful refutation of the racist theories that fueled both Japanese expansionism and American segregation. The material reality of the camp, the steady supply of food, the professional conduct of the guards, the organized labor, proved to be a far more powerful force than the abstract hate taught in Tokyo. In the end, the encounter between Japanese POWs and Black American guards serves as proof that the lines drawn by empires and the fictions created to justify them cannot long survive the simple, sustained, and undeniable reality of human contact.